Every bullet fired at a Mexican civilian has a return address, and it's not Mexico City. Here's what the mainstream press won't frame correctly. When Claudia Sheinbaum stood before the nation and told Donald Trump to stop flooding Mexico with American weapons, she wasn't making a diplomatic gesture. She was naming a system where US-manufactured guns, traced repeatedly by the ATF itself, flow south through legal loopholes, straw purchases, and deliberate policy blindness, and come back north as cartel power, destabilization, and the justification for more American intervention. That's the loop, that's the machine. Mexico loses roughly 30,000 people to organized violence every single year, and study after study, including Mexico's own legal case filed against American gun manufacturers in US federal court, confirms that over 70% of weapons recovered at Mexican crime scenes originate in the United States. So when a sitting president of Mexico looks Washington in the eye and says, "Stop," that's not anti-American sentiment. That's a sovereign nation calling out the most predictable arms pipeline in the Western Hemisphere. And the fact that it makes headlines tells you exactly how rarely anyone in power is allowed to say it out loud. Let's start with the history, because nothing happening right now makes sense without it, and that's exactly how power prefers it: disconnected, ahistorical, stripped of context, so that every crisis looks like it fell from the sky rather than being carefully constructed over decades. Mexico and the United States share the most trafficked border on the planet. Over 1 million legal crossings happen every single day. Commerce, culture, families, food, labor, it all moves through that corridor. And yet, for the better part of 30 years, one thing has moved almost exclusively in one direction: weapons, American weapons, going south, and the money, the fentanyl, the leverage, coming north. That's not a security failure. That is a managed relationship. And managed relationships serve someone. The question worth asking is always, who? When Sheinbaum made her statement, a lot of American commentators responded with predictable deflection. They talked about the cartels, they talked about Mexican corruption, they talked about how Mexico needs to get its house in order before lecturing anyone. And look, Mexican institutional corruption is real. Nobody serious is disputing that. But here's what that framing deliberately obscures. Corruption doesn't exist in a vacuum. It gets financed, it gets armed, it gets protected by interests that extend far beyond Mexico City, far beyond the cartels themselves, and in many cases directly into the financial architecture of the United States. Let's talk about the guns specifically, because this is where the data becomes impossible to argue with if you're willing to sit with it honestly. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, the ATF, has itself confirmed through tracing operations that somewhere between 70 and 90% of firearms recovered at crime scenes in Mexico and submitted for tracing were originally purchased in the United States. Legally purchased, through licensed dealers, mostly in border states: Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico. The pipeline isn't a secret. It has a name. It's called Iron River, and it has been documented, studied, reported on, and largely ignored by the very institutions that have the power to shut it down. Now, why would that be? Why would a government that can mobilize enormous resources to track terrorist financing, monitor foreign intelligence operations, and sanction entire economies somehow struggle to close gun show loopholes and stop straw purchases at licensed dealers just north of the border? The answer, if you're willing to follow it honestly, is that the political economy of the American gun industry is extraordinarily powerful. And that power has been exercised consistently and deliberately to block every meaningful legislative attempt to trace, restrict, or reduce the southward flow of weapons. The gun lobby isn't just protecting the Second Amendment rights of American citizens. It is functionally protecting a market, and that market's best customers are increasingly the criminal organizations operating south of the border. Mexico actually sued American gun manufacturers in federal court. Did you know that? In 2021, the Mexican government filed a lawsuit in Massachusetts federal court against some of the biggest names in the American firearms industry: Smith & Wesson, Barrett Firearms, Colt, Glock, and others. The suit alleged that these companies knowingly facilitated the trafficking of weapons to Mexican cartels. It was a landmark case. It was serious. And in 2022, a federal judge dismissed it, citing the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, a 2005 law that essentially gives gun manufacturers broad immunity from lawsuits related to crimes committed with their products. Mexico appealed. The First Circuit Court of Appeals actually revived part of the case in 2023, allowing some claims to proceed. But the broader point stands. there is a legal fortress built around the American gun industry that makes accountability almost structurally impossible. And that fortress was built by legislators, lobbied into existence, and maintained by political donations. This is not speculation. This is documented public record. So when Sheinbaum stands up and says, "Stop sending weapons to Mexico," she is not making an emotional appeal. She is pointing at a documented, legally contested, politically protected pipeline that is killing tens of thousands of Mexican citizens every year. And the fact that the American political establishment, both parties, let's be honest, responds with either silence or deflection tells you something very important about where the actual power in this relationship sits. Now let's talk about Trump specifically, because this is where it gets even more layered. Trump has made Mexico a centerpiece of his political brand for a decade. The wall, the tariffs, the rhetoric about invasion, the designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And look, some of what Trump says about cartel violence is factually accurate. The cartels are extraordinarily dangerous. The fentanyl crisis is real, and it is devastating American communities. Nobody is saying otherwise. But here is the profound contradiction at the heart of Trump's Mexico policy. You cannot simultaneously designate cartels as terrorist organizations, threaten military action on Mexican soil, and also preside over a domestic policy environment in which the weapons fueling those cartels flow south with near total impunity. You can't have both, unless, of course, the goal isn't actually to solve the problem, but to maintain the problem as a political asset. Think about what sustained cartel violence in Mexico does for certain political agendas in the United States. It justifies border militarization, it justifies expanded surveillance and enforcement budgets, it generates the kind of fear-based political energy that wins elections, it keeps the immigration debate perpetually inflamed, and it provides ongoing justification for the idea that Mexico is a failed state that needs American management rather than a sovereign nation that deserves genuine partnership. The violence, in other words, is not just a tragedy. It is, for some interests, a resource. And resources don't get eliminated, they get managed. Sheinbaum understands this dynamic very well. She's not a naive politician. She came up through the López Obrador movement, AMLO's political project, and she inherited both his nationalist instincts and his willingness to name the structural forces behind Mexico's problems rather than simply moralizing about them. When AMLO was president, he infuriated Washington repeatedly, not by being anti-American in some reflexive way, but by insisting on Mexican sovereignty in concrete, practical terms. He refused to militarize the border on Washington's timeline. He insisted on negotiations with organized crime rather than the kind of frontal military confrontation that had already cost Mexico an estimated 350,000 lives since Felipe Calderón launched the so-called war on drugs in 2006. He called that war, correctly in the view of many serious analysts, a catastrophic failure that empowered the cartels rather than dismantling them. And Sheinbaum has continued in that tradition with her own style and her own emphasis, but with the same fundamental understanding. Mexico's problems cannot be solved by doing more of what created them. Now, the fentanyl question deserves its own serious treatment because it's the single most powerful card the Trump administration plays in this conversation. And it's legitimate up to a point. Fentanyl is killing roughly 70,000 Americans a year. The majority of it is manufactured by cartels using precursor chemicals sourced primarily from China, and it enters the United States through ports of entry, largely in vehicles and mail packages not carried by migrants on foot, which is a crucial distinction that gets systematically blurred in the political conversation. Mexico has taken real steps to intercept fentanyl, more steps, arguably, than the Trump administration acknowledges publicly. But here is the uncomfortable question that almost nobody in American mainstream media is willing to ask. Why is there a domestic demand for fentanyl so massive that it sustains an industry of that scale? Because supply doesn't create addiction epidemics on its own. Demand does. Demand. And the demand for opioids in the United States was created in very large part by American pharmaceutical companies, OxyContin, Purdue Pharma, the whole documented catastrophe of the opioid push in the 1990s and 2000s that addicted millions of Americans and then left them to find cheaper alternatives when the prescriptions ran out. That is the origin story of the fentanyl crisis. It did not begin in Sinaloa. It began in boardrooms in Connecticut and in the prescribing practices of American doctors responding to pharmaceutical marketing campaigns. Mexico is downstream of that history, and blaming Mexico for the fentanyl crisis without reckoning with that history is not analysis, it's propaganda. Let's go deeper into the geopolitical layer, because this conflict between Sheinbaum and Trump is not just a bilateral dispute. It is a microcosm of a much larger restructuring happening in global politics right now. We are living through a period in which the informal rules of the post-Cold War American-led order are breaking down in real time. The idea that American power is fundamentally benign, that American military presence, American economic integration, American political pressure all ultimately serve universal good, that idea is being challenged from every direction simultaneously. From Russia and China, obviously, but also from the global south more broadly, from countries that have been on the receiving end of that power for decades and are now finding both the space and the voice to name their experience publicly. Mexico is part of that shift. Sheinbaum's willingness to stand in front of cameras and tell the most powerful person on the planet to stop arming the criminals killing her citizens, that is not a small thing. In the diplomatic culture of the past 30 years, that kind of directness from a Mexican leader toward Washington would have been almost unthinkable. The political cost would have been too high. The economic leverage, NAFTA, then USMCA, the deep trade integration between the two economies, was always available as a pressure point, and it still is. Trump has already threatened tariffs, he has already rattled the economic cage, and Sheinbaum has not backed down. That tells you something about how the calculus is changing, both in Mexico and in the broader international environment that makes her position politically viable in a way it might not have been a decade ago. There's also the military dimension of Trump's rhetoric that cannot be left unexamined. He has publicly floated the idea of sending American special forces into Mexico to target cartel leadership. His officials have discussed designating cartels in ways that would legally authorize military action. And Mexico has responded with extraordinary firmness: absolutely not. No American military operations on Mexican soil, full stop. Sheinbaum has made this a red line with the same clarity that any leader defending their nation's sovereignty would, and the international legal framework actually supports her entirely. Uninvited military operations inside a sovereign nation's territory are a violation of international law, regardless of who is doing it and regardless of how the target is framed. The fact that this even has to be said out loud, that a neighboring country has to formally remind the United States that it cannot send soldiers into Mexican territory without permission, is itself a signal of how far the rhetoric has gone and how seriously the Mexican government is taking the threat. What we're watching, in other words, is a genuine confrontation between two models of the relationship. One model, the American model as currently articulated by the Trump administration, sees Mexico as a subordinate partner, a country whose policy choices are subject to American approval, whose territory is available for American operations when American interests require it, and whose sovereignty is essentially conditional on compliance. The other model, the Sheinbaum model, insists on genuine equality, genuine respect for territorial integrity, and a relationship built on negotiation and mutual interest rather than pressure and asymmetric leverage. These are not compatible visions, and the tension between them is going to define not just the US-Mexico relationship, but a significant piece of the broader geopolitical landscape for years to come. The deeper historical irony here, and this is the kind of thing that serious analysts of the region cannot ignore, is that the United States has spent enormous political energy over the past 20 years framing Mexico's instability as a Mexican problem requiring American solutions. But the structural roots of that instability, the weapons, the drug demand, the economic pressures of NAFTA that devastated Mexican small agriculture and pushed millions of rural workers into the informal economy and ultimately into the orbit of organized crime, those roots are inseparable from American policy choices: the maquiladora economy, the corn subsidies that undercut Mexican farmers, the financial deregulation that made laundering cartel money through American banks not just possible but, for a period, effectively legal. HSBC paid a fine. Wachovia was absorbed by Wells Fargo after laundering an estimated $380 billion in cartel money. These are not conspiracy theories. These are settled legal cases with documented records. The financial infrastructure of cartel power runs directly through the American banking system. And yet the political conversation continues to locate the problem, entirely, conveniently, south of the border. That is the context in which Sheinbaum's statement lands, not as a provocation, not as political theater, but as a factual accounting of a relationship that has been misrepresented for a very long time. And if you're watching this from the United States, that should matter to you. Not because the United States is uniquely evil or because American citizens bear personal responsibility for the choices of their government and corporations, but because the story you've been told about why Mexico is dangerous and why the border is a crisis and why the cartels are so powerful is an incomplete story. And incomplete stories, when they're the only stories available, serve specific interests. They manufacture consent for specific policies. They make certain interventions seem necessary and certain questions seem irrelevant. Sheinbaum is asking the relevant question. She is asking it publicly, with evidence, with legal backing, and with the full weight of Mexican sovereignty behind it. Whether the American political system is capable of hearing that question honestly, rather than deflecting it, politicizing it, or simply drowning it in noise, is one of the most important tests of this current moment. Because if the answer is no, then the violence continues, the weapons keep flowing, the deaths keep accumulating, and the crisis that serves so many powerful interests stays exactly where those interests need it to be, permanent, managed, and profitable. That is the real story behind this headline, and now you have it.